Hi ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 5 of my Whisky 101 shows. This time we're dialing down onto one of our great brands. My name's Kieran Elliott. I am the National Accounts Manager at Edrington. Edrington is a boutique spirits house, one of Scotland's biggest family-owned companies, spirits companies. And we have a stable of very high-end super premium spirits, the biggest of which, or the most well-known of which, is the Macallan. But we also have Highland Park, Famous Grouse, Glenrothes, Brugal Rum, Partida Tequila, Wyoming Whiskey, Noble Oak is amongst a few others. So, 3 single malts, and I'm going to be doing a history of all 3, starting with the Macallan right now, broken up into 2 parts. But these are the early years, because the setup of the Scotch whisky industry is really quite fascinating. Before I get into all the timelines, I want to address 3 points that I get asked about. When I was National Brand Ambassador, certain things come up time and time again. First of all, where did the name Macallan come from? Now, a lot of people assume that it's Macallan, as in son of Allen, like MacDonald or MacGregor, but it's not. We actually reckon it was 2 Scots Gaelic words that were put together as a portmanteau, if you will. Mag means fertile strip of land in Scots Gaelic. And that area of Speyside, if you've ever been, is beautiful. There's a lot of little mesas, as we call them here in California, lovely alluvial platforms where the river has flooded and the soil is very fertile. And then the Allen, or the Ellen part, we believe is in reference to a travelling Irish monk who's spreading Christianity to Scotland from Ireland, St. Fillan. And we reckon that the Ellen was in reference to St. Fillan, because there is actually a ruined church on the Macallan estate that was built in honour of St. Fillan. He travelled over to Scotland in the 8th century, so had been there a long, long time. So we reckon that's where Macallan comes from, Mag and Ellen. And then I get asked all the time, is Macallan a Speyside malt? Is it a Highland malt? And a lot of people think it's a Speyside malt, and let's face it, it's a classic Speyside style, but it's actually a Highland malt. Macallan is a Highland malt. To be a Speyside malt, your distillery floor has to be within certain wards, otherwise known as shires, if you will. And it was all to do with taxation. It's not about style, as some people think. It's all about taxation. So there's a dotted line throughout Speyside, with these wards. And the Macallan, the original Macallan distillery floor, was just over one of those dotted lines and doesn't fall in the Speyside delineation. It's actually a Highland malt. But interestingly, 2 things. One, we own 1.9 miles of the River Spey frontage and fishing, so we couldn't be more Speyside. And also, there was a classic Scotch fanatic expert called Michael Jackson. Now, I'm assuming that on his business card it read, not the Michael Jackson, the other Michael Jackson. But until the day he died, he refused to refer to Macallan as anything other than a Speyside. He just said it was a classic Speyside. But technically speaking, it's a Highland. That's why it says Highland on every bottle. And then finally, quickly about the curiously small stills, one of our 6 pillars of Macallan, small stills. If you've got a small still, the smaller the still, the higher the percentage contact with the copper on the inside, and percentage contact with copper reduces undesirable flavour profiles. So I asked this question a long time ago, and we had this amazing session with a guy called Charlie McLean. He's a famous Scotch writer, expert, historian, wealth of knowledge, amazing guy. The best part was he wasn't working for a particular brand, and he just gave us the information straight. And he said, I said, what was the thinking behind their curiously small stills? Why would we choose these curiously small stills? And he said, to be quite honest, 200 years ago, it wasn't about choosing as opposed to what can you afford? What do you have the money for? What can you access? And he reckons that the curiously small stills initially was just the size and the shape of the still they could get back in the day when we were first setting up the distillery. And then as the years roll on, you become famous for your style. And of course that's coming from the size and the shape of the still. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in many ways. Glenmorangie has the highest stills in the Scotch whisky industry, really, really tall. And they reckon they're ex-gin stills. It was what they could get at the time. And that's what produces their particular style. So I just thought it was really fascinating that it wasn't necessarily, we're going to do this particular thing. It was like, what can we afford? Right, get it. in the distillery now. So that's a couple of the points that I get asked about regularly. Right, on to the history, on to the timeline. When we talk about the distillery and the estate and Easter Elky's house, one of the first timelines is 1700. Easter Elky's house, our wonderful Jacobean manor house, was built in 1700. Now, the estate had been there for many, many years, but this is when we really started to propagate it. Easter Elky's house was built in 1700 by Captain John Grant using locally mined or locally sourced sandstone, and he built the house, Jacobean Manor House. And they reckon we had been distilling whiskey in that area. People had been distilling illicitly because it wasn't legal until you got a registration after the Excise Act. But people have been making whiskey illegally on that site since at least the 1700s. If you want to know more about the alcohol creation process and the discovery of alcohol and how it spread through Europe, that was what my last show was on, distillation, so please check that one out. But now, we went legit, if you will. We started legally producing alcohol at the Macallan Distillery, what's now known as the Macallan Distillery, in 1824. Mainly because in 1823, the year before, they brought in the Excise Act. Now, up until that point, people have been distilling illicitly, and if you got caught, you were heavily taxed, heavily taxed. So they decided to do more of a registration model rather than taxation. So they created this system whereby you register to be allowed to distill, you pay £10, £10, I tell you, per year, and you get less taxation. You're taxed less heavily per gallon of alcohol. And one of the first people to go legit, if you will, was George Smith. George Smith set up Glenlivet just a few months after the Excise Act came into account in 1824. And as sort of first to market, he established his name. And that will come on to be more important in just a second. I'm going to come back to that because there's an interesting fact that rolled on from that we'll talk about in just a second. But up until that point, we've been making Scotch. So, I don't want you to think that we started making Scotch in 1824. 1824 wasn't the year we started making Scotch. That was the year we got caught. That was the year we decided to go legit, and away we go. And the funny thing was, a lot of the distilleries that were creating whiskey in those days, because Glenlivet was one of the first ones to market and became a geographical indicator, a GI, very similar to cognac or champagne or Bordeaux. It became a regional geographical delineator or indicator. A lot of distilleries added Glenlivet at the end, and it was kind of a trademark infringement in modern day terms. And there was loads of them. Most of them in that region used that until it was banned and outlawed. But we decided to go legit in 1824. Alexander Reid was a farmer and a teacher in Speyside, and he founded the distillery then and started creating the alcohol. Now, where the distillery is based, the estate, we have a 485-acre estate in the heart of Speyside. The warehouses contain approximately 400,000 casks at the moment. It's a huge operation. But when Alexander Reid started it, it was a shed with 2 stills. It was just a farm shed with 2 stills. It wasn't a big operation. But it was perfectly placed to get the drovers as they were bringing the cattle to and from market. Because Speyside is kind of the access point to the high Highlands, way beyond sort of Inverness and way up into the Moray Firth area and way up into the top of the Highlands. And so a lot of the cattle would come through this area. And there was allegedly a bridge across the River Spey, very close to the estate. So they reckoned that Alexander Reid was selling his whiskey to the thirsty farmers, as it were, as they came through the estate. And that's how he got established, and that's how he got to make his name, as it were. Now, that was 1824. Alexander Reid managed the distillery until he died in 1847. Then his son took over and managed it until he died in 1858. And then there was a bit of a dark period for whiskey in Scotland. There was a bit of a depression, economic slump, if you will, and sales started to dwindle. The marketplace was very difficult. A lot of people were getting into difficulties, debts, etc., etc. But a very unusual and very surprising event happened that made Scotch. It really, really brought Scotch whisky and Irish whisky to the forefront of people's minds. In 1878, there was the phylloxera blight. Phylloxera is a little pest that attacks the roots of vines, of grapevines, and it wiped out 97% of all the grapevines in France and into Spain. Now at that time, the royalty, the noblemen, the people in the street were all drinking brandy and cognac and wine, and of course that was all wiped out. And they had to drink something to get them through the day. So they all switched to whiskey. Now at the time, Irish whiskey was the thing. Irish whiskey was the big dog. They had really got into it and really had started to build amazing brands. So Irish whiskey was doing very well. But then Innis Coffee came along with his coffee still, his continually running column still. Makes a less expensive alcohol, but it's lacking in character. So you blend in single malts, hence blended whiskey. So this really, the phylloxera virus was the point where Scotch whiskey and Irish whiskey really started to come into their own. And then Scotch whiskey took over because the Irish said, oh no, this column still, this continually running, that's not real whiskey. It has to be made in a pot still. And we're like, what? A bargain? Less expensive? That's for me. I'm Scottish. So we really took to the blended Scotches, and blends really, really took off at this time. Less expensive bottling, and a lot of blends started to proliferate. Interesting thing about the blends tend to be named after somebody rather than some place. Blends are Bells, Grants, even Famous Grouse is named after a bird. It's not named after an area, but the malts tend to be named after an area. And what you have to realise is the names predate the Scotches by hundreds of years. For example, I talked about Glenlivet. Glen in Scotland just means valley, or it's the valley of the river, whatever comes next. So Glenlivet is the valley of the river Livet. And the reason you've got Glenmorangie, Glenfiddich, Glenfarclas, we have Glenrothes. The reason they're always talking about valleys is it was the perfect place to hide from the excise guys. You tuck into the mountains and you make your Scotch. You've got lovely rolling streams with clean water, and they were all tucked up into these little river valleys, and that's why there's so many glens involved. And then of course we're Macallan, fertile land, so the names predate the actual Scotches by many, many years. So that was kind of the basic, that's the way back history. The other big timeline, the other big event in Macallan's history is Roderick Kemp. Roderick Kemp is really the architect of the modern era of Macallan. He bought the distillery, we were doing okay at this point, but he bought the distillery in 1892, and he really heavily invested in taking it from a little podunk, a little sort of mom and pop operation, into being a huge international success story. He renamed it R. Kemp Macallan Glenlivet, and it was one of the many distilleries that had the Glenlivet epithet or postscript, if you will. At that time, there was actually 9 distilleries that were using the Glenlivet name. I've got them written down over here. Glenlossie, Macallan, Aberlour, Ben Rhymes, Cragganmore, Linkwood, Glenrothes, Glengrant and Mortlach were all using Glenlivet at the end. And by the time the major court case came along in the 1980s, there was 28 of them, and they all had to drop that Glenlivet part at the end. But it was a GI, it was like saying, we're from this amazing area that makes amazing whiskies, and that's how that came around. But anyway, Roderick Kemp took over and invested heavily in the stillhouse, in the warehousing, but more importantly, in the quality of the product. He brought in very high quality grain. We started using Golden Promise, which has always been talked about as being the king of whiskey grains, until it became the production level, the yield started to drop and the price went up, so a lot of people switched. But he brought in high quality grains, and in particular, Roderick Kemp brought in the heavy reliance, almost sole reliance, on sherry seasoned casks. And he was insistent that although it's way more expensive, it creates a phenomenal product. And in particular, he identified the fact that the curiously small stills that Macallan have now become famous for were amazing at pumping out this very rich, oily, thick, buttery, heavy alcohol. Now, if you put a big, rich, heavy alcohol like that in a basic cask, it's going to overpower the wood. They found that the European oak married with sherry seasoning created the perfect balance. This rich, heavy liquid wasn't overpowered by the sherry, and the sherry just worked perfectly with the liquid. So it was just the perfect marriage. More expensive, admittedly, but in those days, sherry was coming in to Scotland and the UK easily, and we were sending it back out in these sherry seasoned casks. So there was a great availability of the sherry seasoned casks. So he brought in that era of high quality. Now, I mentioned that the blends had taken off at this point. So the blended scotches were really popular. And when you make a blend, you get your base alcohol and then you blend in your single malts. Now, Macallan became highly sought after as a dressing malt, as a top malt, meaning you get your neutral grain spirit, about 70% of the bottle is neutral grain spirit. Then you blend in your single malts. Maybe you've got a gently peated one like Highland Park. Maybe you've got some grassy or some gentle whiskies. But then Macallan was always put in as the top malt to give it that big character, lots of flavour. So it was highly sought after. And that rolls us into the sort of more modern era of the 50s and the 60s. 50s and 60s, great era for blended Scotch. But by the time you get into the 70s, the blend started to fall off and the single malts start to come through. I'll come back to that in a minute, because in 1961 was another major era or timeline in Macallan's history. And that was the distillery had sort of been progressively changed or given through family members, and it ended up with the Robertson sisters. Agnes, Ethel and Elspeth. Not easy to say if you have a list. But the three Robertson sisters were bequeathed Macallan, and they were subject to a hostile takeover attempt, and they nearly lost the distillery. So in 61, they bequeathed their holdings to the Robertson's Trust, or they created the Robertson's Trust. And the Robertson's Trust is now Scotland's largest charity. And the charity was set up specifically to give money to impoverished women and children, initially in Scotland, but then as time has gone on around the world. And the Robertson's Trust give away tens of millions of dollars every year to charities around the world. So that is an incredible part of who we are, that charity element. So if it wasn't for the Robertson sisters, we wouldn't have the Robertson's Trust, and we wouldn't have Edrington the way we know it now. And then finally, my final point in the timeline of this sort of the more ancient history is 1980. Believe it or not, Macallan, as it stands now, wasn't formed until 1980. 1980 is when we changed the name to just the Macallan. Now, don't get me wrong, we have stocks, we have barrels aging way back. We have one cask, it's called the Golden Cask, that's from 1926. That, we distilled and we still have it. But we changed the name to the Macallan in 1980, and that was the start of the modern era under the name of the Macallan. And then finally, just to bring it all full circle, because Glenlivet were getting really annoyed at everyone using their name, they eventually were awarded the ability to call themselves the Glenlivet. And that's what set off all of or a lot of the single malt Scotches calling themselves the something, just like it is the Macallan. So if you're wondering why it's the Macallan, it's because it just became the in thing to stamp your authority on it and make sure no one sort of piggybacks off your name. So there we are.